Okay, so for my restoration project, I am doing a presentation video, kind of podcasty vibes, um, to talk about three of my ancestors who actually were involved in the restoration. And so I'm super excited, and I've done a lot of research and I have my notes. So if I'm looking down, that's what I'm looking at. But I'm super excited to tell about their stories and their involvement in the restoration and how they were able to help the early church members in their journey of establishing Zion. And so as I share about them, I'll have a few pictures, but mostly it's just going to be me talking. Hopefully it's fun and something enjoyable and interesting to hear about. Um, I have learned a lot about the restoration through doing this project, and especially because I studied about my own family. I feel like I have a deeper connection with it because it's more personal and something that's connected to me. And I think a lot of us, in a way or another, we can find a connection with the restoration, whether it's through family members or through similar experiences of joining the church or through going through something hard and just trying to keep faith. But I'm super excited and we're going to get started. Okay. So the first person I wanted to highlight and talk about is Orson Pratt. And Orson Pratt, he was born in 1811 and he was born in the United States in Hartford, New York. And when he was 19, his brother, Parley P. Pratt, taught him about the gospel and baptized him. And a few months later, Joseph Smith confirmed him and gave him the Melchizedek, or conferred, not confirmed, but conferred the Melchizedek priesthood on him and sent him on a mission to, I think it was Toronto, Canada. Yeah, Toronto. And so he, just like a new convert, within a few months was out on a mission, which I think is super scary. I think it's a little bit, brave of him, because I think it would have been really hard to go on a mission not having had a lot of time of membership and not knowing all of the things about the gospel. But he was able to go out on a mission, and he actually baptized John Taylor, which is another person we'll talk about later. So he baptized John Taylor and his family when he was in Toronto. And then he came back and he was called as an apostle in 1835. And then he served a second mission in the British Isles. And that mission lasted between 1839 and 1841. And so in this time when he left on his second mission, he had already been married. You can see at the bottom, there's a picture of him and his family. His wife was named Sarah Pratt. And when he returned from his mission, he kind of came back to the Saints, and there had been a lot that had happened since he had left. In that time, polygamy had come to light, and they started to open up how they practiced polygamy. And he had never heard of polygamy. I just can't even imagine in that time what it would have been like to not have known what was happening in the church headquarters at the time. And just like getting back and just like hearing all of these things that seem kind of wild, but that the saints had adapted to, or they had learned about, or they had time to process it. But when he returned, there was a man named John C. Bennett, who was an apostate member of the church, who we don't they think it's a rumor, but we don't really know exactly if it was 100% true or 100% false, or if it was just like a mix up or twisted words. But basically, Pratt was stunned to hear about the news about polygamy, and John C. Bennett accused Joseph Smith of proposing marriage to Sarah Pratt, Orson Pratt's wife, while he was gone. And then Joseph Smith denied the accusation, but Sarah Pratt supported it and said that that did happen. And so in that moment, Orson Pratt was super frustrated, and he had a really hard time, understanding why polygamy. And then he had a really hard time when he heard that Joseph Smith tried to propose marriage to his wife while he was gone without his knowledge. And so he thought about it for a few days, and Joseph Smith and the members of the 12 apostles were trying to talk to him at the time, because in this moment he was a member of the 12 apostles. And they finally kind of just knew he wasn't going to change his mind. And so they excommunicated him and his wife from the church. And I think that would have been really hard to have been serving a mission and sacrificing so much for the church, and to come back and to see that it's completely different than what you left it as. And that, I think it would have been hard to have the ideas of polygamy started when you weren't there and you weren't aware of it. That kind of makes it seem a little bit darker than it really, really was or was supposed to be. And so he was excommunicated in August of 1842. And he started to feel really guilty, and he started to realize that the other member, John C. Bennett, had twisted truths, had twisted words, and had caused him and his family to fall away from the church. And so it says in his journal that he went as far as even having thoughts of like self-harm and suicide. And he probably was in a state of depression because he knew that the church was true. And because he didn't sustain Joseph Smith, he was excommunicated, but he knew that the gospel was true and that he needed to get back to it. And so he was able to talk to Joseph Smith, and they kind of made up. And Joseph Smith extended his love and forgiveness to Orson Pratt and his wife and rebaptized them himself on January 20th, 1847. So it was just a short time, well, 5-ish years, that he was, I can only think of like the Spanish word, that he was like far away from the church. And so after that happened, he was reinstated as a member of the 12 Apostles, which he actually was an original member of the 12 Apostles. And he had the opportunity to go back to that calling. And then I think that speaks a lot about his character, that he was willing to admit why he was wrong and that he was wrong, and to come back and to be able to return to being an apostle. I think a lot of times in our day and age, we are really hard on ourselves and we are really judgmental of other members. And we think like, oh, they made that mistake or they made that error. Like they can't, I mean, they can come back. Forgiveness is always real, but it's really hard and it takes a long time. And sometimes that can be true, but I think it's really admirable that he fell away. He was really apostate. He went from being a missionary to apostate to being an apostle. And so I think it talks a lot, or it speaks a lot to how it worked, how the church worked in the early times, because they were all just figuring it out. I think I read that he was the only member of the 12 apostles that had been like excommunicated up until that point, because he was a part of the original 12 that were called under Joseph Smith. And so I think that's super admirable. And I also think that polygamy is something that a lot of people struggled with, even the leaders of the church. And it makes sense why that would happen. But I think there's also something to be said about how we wrestle with questions, and how the people, the early saints, they had to wrestle with lots of questions. And a lot of times they didn't have enough time to really process it like we do now. They had to make the decision to follow the prophet and act on it, or to leave, or to not sustain the prophet in the way that they would if they would practice the practice fully, if that makes sense. So I think it's really important that we have grace for the early saints, especially when we're talking about polygamy and their actions and what their reactions were. And just know that we probably have a different outlook on it now than they did back then. But I think it's definitely an important part of church history that definitely contributed to a lot of the problems that the church faced legally and within the saints themselves, because they weren't all on the same page and they didn't all accept the doctrine on the same level at the same time. And I think that's okay. And I think that's something that we just have to understand how to work through, and understand that that was a part of our history. And yeah, so that's on polygamy. And then after, he was a scout. He was one of the first Mormons, or one of the first pioneers to enter the Salt Lake City Valley on July 21st in 1847. And he was kind of a scout. There's a picture up here that I really like that I put in. Oh, wrong way. This picture right here where it's Orson Pratt and then another person arriving to the Salt Lake City Valley. So I think it was really awesome that he was able to help a lot of people cross the plains and make a lot of hard work a little bit lighter, and that he was someone that people looked up to and that they tried to follow, and that they trusted to send him ahead and to lead and guide the church in a way on the plains. And then at the end of his life, later when he was in Utah, he was a very impressive historian and writer and speaker. And so he was appointed to be the church historian in 1874. And then he also was in charge of the revisions that resulted in the 1876 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. So it's kind of cool that because of his efforts, we now, have seen the progression of the Doctrine and Covenants, but he took a step towards making that what it is today. And then he also supported Brigham Young. They had a little bit of conflict, but for the most part, he supported Brigham Young. And then I think they had a little falling out at the end there. But when he supported Brigham Young, a lot of people, the general body of the church followed with what Orson Pratt was doing because they knew that he supported Joseph Smith and that he had that testimony of that prophet. And then when he showed that I'm so sorry. I just got out of Spanish class and everything's in Spanish in my head, even though I don't know it that well. So it might be a little slow. That he was faithful and he looked up to Brigham Young just like he did Joseph Smith. They were willing to follow Brigham Young with less hesitation, which I think is a really important attribute to have, is that they could see his devotion and his faith to the prophet. And so they followed it, even though he wasn't a main character or a main leader that needed people to follow him. He could help others follow the prophet, which in a sense is helping others come closer to Christ by following his prophet. And so one thing that Brigham Young assigned Orson Pratt to do was to speak on difficult assignments. And one of those included the 1852 announcement to the church and the world of the doctrine of plural marriage. So I think that's super interesting how Orson Pratt went from not being able to understand plural marriage or being able to sustain it to being able to defend it in a wider, grander setting, in the world setting. And he also had conversations with government officials talking about plural marriage and why they do it and defending the practice for the good of the church. So it's kind of a whole 180 right there that he was able to, through his faith, come to receive that revelation, or at least to know it well enough to trust God enough that he was able to help the church in that sense, and that he was able to work with the leaders of the world as well as the church to find common ground as long as that lasted. And then I think he passed away in the United States. He passed away in Utah at some point. I think he's buried in Salt Lake. I think there's his little tombstone. But I think Orson Pratt was a really important figure in church history, especially in the Restoration, as he worked closely under Joseph Smith, and he served a lot of missions. He was able to open up a lot of proselyting for a lot of the people that followed him, and he kind of was a pioneer of how that worked. And he was able to bring a lot of members to Zion, to wherever the church headquarters were at that time, through his missionary efforts. And that helped strengthen the church, bring more people in, and then he was able to have his waves of up and downs. But I think that was good for the community to see that people can come back, always can come back, and they can always change. And as he did change, he had a stronger testimony, and people saw, okay, if this guy can do it, so can I. So he definitely was someone to look up to, and he had a big impact on the church that we have today, especially in the beginning. Okay, the next guy is John Taylor. He's my 4th great grandfather, and I forgot to say that, but Orson Pratt's my 3rd great grandfather. And John Taylor was born in 1808 in England, and then his family moved to Toronto when he was a younger boy. And John Taylor has an interesting story because he was born and then he moved, but then he had a vision when he was a young boy. And in his vision, he saw a vision of an angel with a trumpet sounding a message to the nations, but he didn't understand what his vision was. He was born into the Church of England, and then he didn't feel good about it. So when he was about 16 years old, he had a religious awakening, and that led him to join the Methodist Church. And he liked that a lot better. He became a Methodist minister or a preacher. And he was super educated as well, but then he didn't feel right about it. So he kind of left and went to a group of just discoverers. They were searchers of the truth. So they didn't really associate with a church, but they were just seeking more light and knowledge of the gospel. And he was able to receive that when Orson Pratt went to Toronto and found his family and baptized them. And John Taylor said that the things that made him change his mind, because in the beginning he didn't really want anything to do with the church, but he said that when he read the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, he knew that it was the word of God and that he needed to join the church. And so he did. He joined the church because he was not satisfied with the other churches that he'd been a part of. And he was baptized in May of 1836 with his family, and then he was ordained to the office of an elder. And then in March of 1837, so less than a year later, he moved to Kirkland, Ohio, and was called to serve as a member of the 12 Apostles. He was called by Joseph Smith to be one of the apostles, which I think is very interesting that he only was a member for less than a year, and then he just moved to Kirkland and was a prophet, or not, sorry, not a prophet, but he was an apostle, which was like an assistant to the prophet. So I think, I mean, that would never be something that happens now, but I think back in early church history times, the people needed to not mature quicker, but they needed to mature quicker in the gospel, and they needed to become leaders sooner than we do now. They didn't have the luxury of having all the time to study everything out, but they really were led by God and by the Spirit, not knowing exactly what they should do beforehand. And I think that is a trait that is hard to do. It's hard to master, but he was able to accomplish that as he was obeying leadership around him, following the prophet, and living the gospel of Jesus Christ. Okay, so he also had a lot of contributions to the church. He was a writer. He liked writing songs. He liked writing poems, articles, papers. So he was responsible for writing a few newspapers for the church, including the Times and Seasons and the Nauvoo Neighbor. And then he worked on a few other church publications. Also, kind of like Orson Pratt, spoke out about different things that the world struggled with to help either the members or the world understand the concept of the gospel principle better. So he was a very educated and clean-cut guy who represented very well the church. And he was very different than a lot of other people that were part of the church, just for the reason that he was super educated and that he strived to have that clean look and to be very sophisticated, where sometimes other people didn't value that as much because of their upbringing or their history or their past. We know that Joseph Smith didn't have a very profound education, religiously or secularly, but then he was able to complete everything he needed to as well. But I think having John Taylor have background in that kind of stuff really boosted the church forward when it came to talking about certain things and publicating other things and, getting official things done. And so it was interesting how he was prepared from the beginning to have this calling as an apostle and a prophet when he was a teenager, that he had seen a vision and that when he found the gospel, he knew it was that vision that was talking to him and that the message that the angels were sharing with their trumpets was the message of the restored gospel. And that's also why it was easier for him to accept that, is because that was helping him to understand his vision that he had had. John Taylor is also well known for being in Carthage jail with Joseph Smith when he was martyred. And there's so much about that story on all of their accounts, but John Taylor has a very interesting account of it. And because he was a talented writer, he did a very good job of getting details and making it a way, or writing it in a way that really helps you understand everything that was going on. So before Joseph Smith was martyred, he had requested that John Taylor sing "A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief." And John Taylor said, "No, I'm not in the mood." But then Joseph Smith insisted, and he sang that song for Joseph while he was in his final hours of captivity in Carthage jail. And then when the mob came in to enter the room, we all know that all those four men, they got up and they were trying to block the door until the mob started shooting through the door, and then they hit Hiram, and then Hiram died. Joseph Smith ran over to Hiram, and then he ran back to the door trying to keep the men out. And one thing that I think is interesting, I think you can see it in this picture, is John Taylor. He's known for having a walking cane that he used to keep the mob out as much as he could. He was just like hitting the door shut with it and hitting people, their like muskets, through the door when it was open, trying just to keep them out as long as they could. But we know that that didn't last super long. And I was reading in the Joseph Smith history papers, John Taylor's account of this event, and he said that he had the thought to go out the window because he thought that maybe there would be friends or allies of them outside. And so he got to the window and he was shot a few times. And he felt himself falling forward out the window, but something just like immediately pushed him back in and he fell on the floor. And he recognized that in his writing as a tender mercy that he didn't fall out because, I mean, scientifically, if we're talking about physics, he should have fallen out by how he was hit. But he actually fell inside and he was kind of blown away by that. And he looked at it as a tender mercy that he was spared in that moment because he had more things to do here on the earth and his time wasn't quite done yet. And so I like that detail because it just shows that he was preserved, as well as there's a famous story about his pocket watch that he had that was like right over his chest, and that he was shot, and his pocket watch took the bullet instead of his, I think it was his heart. So he would have probably died and been fatally wounded if that pocket watch hadn't intervened as it did, which is just another tender mercy that he was spared again. And so he took a few shots in that instance, and one of them he had in his leg that he never got removed. It was just in his leg for the rest of his life. And after he was shot, he kind of hid under the bed until Joseph Smith fell out of the window. And when Joseph Smith fell down out of the window, the whole mob ran down to find him below. And so Brother Richards and Brother Taylor were left in the Carthage jail by themselves. And Brother Richards actually dragged Brother Taylor over to like the cell part of the jail and was apologizing to him and put him under a dirty mattress and just said, "I'm sorry, I can't do anything else for you. They're gonna come back and kill me in a minute. I'm sure of it. But like, good luck. Hopefully you live long enough to tell the story." And so I just think in this story, it's really cool because um, it shows a connection that Joseph Smith had with John Taylor, that they were, you know, allies enough that they were both in jail together. And honestly, the mob really only wanted Joseph, and the other men that went with him, they were kind of wanted, but they were also just sacrificing their lives to support the prophet and to try to protect their friend as well. And it shows a lot how heartbroken they were that Hiram and Joseph were murdered, but also it shows that they were needed at a later time. And Joseph Smith, um, he taught a lot to John Taylor as well as his other counselors and apostles, and they needed to have that information to keep the church going on. And so I think it's really interesting that he was preserved. Like in that story, he's preserved like 3 or 4 different times. So there's tiny little miracles that kept him safe, and he was able to make it out and able to write about that story. So we have those details about what happened, and that we're able to reflect on the bravery and the faith that these men had to keep going when it was difficult and keep going, even though it wasn't maybe exactly their fight to fight. They were willing to stand up for their friends and do everything they could to um, help the gospel go forward. And I just think that speaks a lot to their testimony and their character. That I don't know how many members of the church today would be willing to step into their shoes. It would be very, very difficult, especially because they all have families and they're all involved in many things that are important outside of just being apostles. But at the end of the day, that was the most important thing to them, and so they defended it with their lives. And then they crossed the plains. John Taylor crossed the plains as well, and he made it to Utah. And he was sustained the president of the church on October 10th of 1880 during one of the most challenging periods of church history. So in this time, polygamy was very, very popular, and Brigham Young had kind of instituted it a little bit more fully than Joseph Smith was able to. And so many more people were aware of what was happening, and it began to become a legal issue. And so they were having a lot of trouble with the government, and they were working really hard to follow this law that they were given to live at the time while also being law-abiding citizens. And they were trying to like have their cake and eat it too, be good citizens, but also do what they thought in that time was the best thing to do and that what God wanted them to do. And so that was very difficult. And John Taylor had 16 wives. So he was very familiar with polygamy. He had 16 wives. I don't know how many children he had, but it's something like 60 something. He had a lot of kids, a lot of descendants. And in his time, 8 years after he was set apart as a prophet, the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887 was an act that Congress passed to target the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to restrict polygamy. And so that caused a lot of tension within Utah, within the saints, within the states and the government, and it caused a lot of problems. So he actually lived the last few years of his life in hiding. And he would sometimes have appearances, or he'd sometimes speak to the members of the church, and he'd always say, "I wish I could see you guys, but I can't for these reasons." He was also declining rapidly with health problems. And so it was a really tricky time for the saints because their prophet was in hiding. They didn't really have a leader that was able to come and address them personally or be with them as much as would have been helpful. But he still was able to fulfill his duties as the prophet until he passed away finally in Kaysville, Utah on July 25th, 1887. And so I think John Taylor, he kind of saw the church from the beginning of the Restoration and then for many years after, which I think is really unique because Joseph Smith passed away pretty soon after establishing the church. He wasn't around for a very long time to see everything blossom and begin to really go super strong and super well, I guess. And then Brigham Young, he had a lot of trials as well with crossing the plains, and he had his own sets of challenges. But John Taylor was able to go from a convert in Canada to being a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles when he was with Joseph Smith. And then he was able to be prophet himself. And another thing that he did that was super, super important in church history is he served many missions. Since the topic was more of the Restoration and less about missions, I didn't choose to include all of those, but he served many missions. He served as a mission president. He served in Europe. And through all of his hard work, through missionary work, he was able to open the gates and the doors for missionary work in other languages and other countries. And so I think that's something that was really important because that was one way that the church was able to spread the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's how they were able to get more people to come to Zion, come to Utah to build up their cities. And I think it's really unique that he was one of the first prophets to take the gospel abroad further, like much further than just like Toronto and England, because Canada and England are kind of like where everyone's from. That kind of came all to Missouri. But then going further out than that is something that didn't happen a lot until he was prophet. And I'm not saying it never happened at all. It just wasn't as common as it became after he served his time as prophet and after he served his mission. And then lastly, okay, we have Timothy Bradley Foote. So the other two that I mentioned are a little bit more common in church history. We've heard about them before. Timothy Bradley Foote is also my fourth great grandfather, and he's a little less well known in church history, but he was more of like your average saint. And he really is a great example of being a stalwart saint, of being faithful, of having no fear, of taking courage, of doing what the Lord asks, even though it's hard. And so he was born on December 29th in 1799 in Connecticut. And he actually had the opportunity to fight in the War of 1812 with his dad at the age of 14. And he served 4 months in the New York militia. And he was a part of Major Benjamin Forth's cavalry. So I thought that was really a unique detail that he was able to fight in a war at the age of 14 with his father. I didn't know that was something that they allowed 14-year-olds to do, but that was something that he was excited to do and wanting to do. And it turns out that later on, that experience will have been something that prepared him for what came later. So he was baptized with his wife, Jane Ann, in September of 1833, and then they later moved to Nauvoo, Illinois. Sorry, I just read that with an S. And they lived there from 1838 to 1846. And so that's when they got baptized, and they joined the Saints in Nauvoo, kind of like the church headquarters. They're not exactly sure when. It says by 1841, but there's stories and journal entries that prove that they were there by at least the late 1838. And so he was there. He was a member that was a part of the Missouri extradition attempt. And basically what happened in that took place in November of 1838, is many of the saints and their neighbors were arrested under the direction of Governor Boggs by a group of men, kind of just like a mob. But they were arrested and by a lot of armed men, and they were taken to jail. And so they were prisoners for many days. And then after, they were told to leave the state immediately, to get their families and to leave. And he got permission and he went and he saw his family and he helped them get out of the state. but he wasn't ready to quite leave the state because in that time, legislation was about to be passed to help these people, to help the saints get protection under the law, and so that they weren't facing abuse like they were. And this event was completely unprovoked, as stated in history and in a lot of the journals that I read. And they were supposed to be really close. They had a lot of promising ideas or promising words from authorities that they were going to do something about it and that the things were going to change and that legislation would be passed to help the saints out and to protect them, but that never came. And so because that didn't ever come and he knew that the situation that they were in could be life-threatening, he thought that it would be better just to leave the state. So he was forced to sell all of his stuff, and he recorded that the guy that bought the stuff, the purchaser, he was the one that set the terms. That Bradley Foote didn't, or Timothy Foote didn't really have the pull to say, this is what I want for my whole farm and my land and my house. He didn't get to choose, and since he was in such a bad situation, he just had to take his farm, or had to just take it for what he could get it for. So he ended up selling everything by less than half of what he bought it for. And he was really frustrated with that because he thought that things were going to change and he thought that he was going to be able to stay there with his family. And then it was hard to having to leave all of his stuff, knowing that he got a very small amount for what it should have been worth. And so there's one story that stood out to me that I really liked. Reportedly, when Joseph Smith there was a time where President Boggs got shot. Someone tried to like assassinate him in his house. And everyone kind of immediately pointed fingers at Joseph Smith that he was involved or that he was guilty of this crime. And so they sent people out to arrest him. And they had kind of sentenced Joseph Smith to death. And so when he had heard that they had sentenced the prophet to death, he grabbed his rifle and went to find Joseph Smith. And he offered to save Joseph Smith's life by changing places with him. So he literally like offered to, if needs be, save the prophet and then give his own life for the sake of saving Joseph Smith, which I thought was super unique, because I don't know if I would have been able to do that. But Timothy Foote had such a testimony of the prophet of Joseph Smith. He was super loyal. He was super, he was sure that he was a prophet of the Lord and that he needed to listen to everything that he said and asked him to do. And when he showed up to take Joseph's spot, he found that the prisoners were already getting rescued and that the accusers were already being persecuted for their actions. And so his first wife and him, Jane Ann, had 7 kids. The last one was born in 1843 in August, and then Jane passed away in December of 1843. So I can only imagine what it would have been like to have 7 little kids and to be a widower and to not have the support of your wife and to have all these little kids and not know what to do and not to have a lot of money and to be being persecuted during that whole time. And I just think it's really something quite common. I think oftentimes back in the day that there was children or adults that didn't live as long as we do now for health reasons or for just natural causes. And I think it would have been really difficult to maintain that faith, that the church is worth it, that the church is true, when you're feeling like you're just facing trial after trial with persecution, the loss of his wife, with having 7 kids that he doesn't know how to care for and how to balance working and how to balance teaching them the gospel and being their parent. And that led him to remarry in 1847, in July of 1847, 4 years later. So kind of a big gap. And then his next wife was named Nancy. And with Nancy, Timothy immigrated to Utah. He was a part of Brigham Young's company, and he actually ended up being one of the leaders in the company. He was one of the captains. And he took some of his kids from his first marriage and his wife Nancy, and they headed to Utah. And they fortunately arrived in September of 1848. And something that I thought was crazy that I've never thought about before is that women were pregnant sometimes while crossing the plains, which I think is so crazy because I've never thought about that in my entire life. So one fun fact is that Timothy Bradley Foote's wife, Nancy, she gave birth in Immigration Canyon 4 days before they entered Salt Lake City Valley. And I just thought that was unreal, that she was willing to trek over to Utah, being pregnant like she was, and knowing that it was a possibility that she was going to give birth in the plains. And I guess now it sounds crazy because I'm like, we have hospitals and a lot of things, and they didn't really have that as much. But she had to walk like every single day and like do stuff and be active and have really poor living conditions that are much worse than what she would have had if she stayed in Navajo. And I look up to her and her faith, and I think his faith as well, that they as a family were willing to make that sacrifice and commitment and to trust in the Lord and know that He would bless them for their efforts and that He would help them cross the plains. And I just think like it would take a lot of faith and a lot of strength to be able to do that and to be on the same page about it. Um, and then his last daughter, not the one that was born on the plains, but his last daughter with his first wife, passed away a few days, like a few months later after they made it to Utah, which would have also been a big trial that they were facing all at once, just like moving to Utah, having a baby, losing another baby. And I just think for a lot of times for the saints, as the trials just didn't ever stop. And sometimes in our lives, we feel like the trials don't stop, and they probably don't sometimes. I think that's kind of what life's all about, is just learning how to trust in the Lord, even though we have trials that are really big and difficult for us to bear, that as we rely on our Savior Jesus Christ, that He will lift those burdens for us. And I think there are many early saints who are amazing examples of that, that they let the Lord carry them through their trials and that they chose to follow Him in faith instead of falling away in fear. And so after that, Timothy was appointed by Brigham Young to do a few projects. So he was a supervisor of the building of the San Juan Stake Tabernacle, and he served on a committee in charge of building it. And while they were over there, they were really exposed to Indian attacks. And Timothy Foote recorded that he was not afraid of the Indians, that he was familiar with war, he was familiar with how to use a gun, how to defend himself, and that was not afraid of them. And so I think it's kind of interesting how he was also prepared, just like John Taylor was prepared and he was protected to be the prophet. Timothy Foote was also prepared to have that background in military and in defending himself and feeling comfortable in those maybe intense situations. And so he was able to defend their construction and their families while they were down there and exposed to the Indian attacks that were happening. And then he founded Nephi, Utah, which I think was pretty cool. I mean, Nephi is just a great place we pass through when we're going to St. George, but that's where he founded, and he was a judge there, I think is what it said in some of the articles that I read. And he served as a second counselor in the Nephi branch in 1854. So I think it's really cool. That made a big impact on Utah, at least to get that city up and running. And then for the church to start a branch that probably led to a stake that probably has multi-stake. It's really grown a lot in the last 200 years. And then that led to Timothy's death at age 86 on April 18th of 1886. And he passed away in Nephi as well. So he kind of just lived his life there with his family. And that's basically it about him. Anyways, so that's my project. I really hope you guys enjoyed hearing a little bit more about the details that are a little bit unique or that we don't always hear about the restoration. And I think, like I said in the beginning, we can always make connections between ourselves and the restoration. And I think that's why this project had the biggest impact on me personally, is because I was able to connect to it in a family way. And a lot of the resources that I got were off of family journals and documents saved on Family Search. And it was really cool to see how much the church had grown in that time period thanks to their efforts, as well as the efforts of many others, but also how the church continues to grow through our efforts. And just like they had to sacrifice for the church and that they had to do hard things to keep it going, we need to sacrifice things to help the church grow, like serving missions, like choosing to live the gospel instead of not living the gospel just because it's hard. I think all of these three people are great examples of teaching us how to wrestle with questions and doubts when we aren't sure what the truth is, or we aren't sure if we're okay with doctrinal principles. They struggled with polygamy, and that was kind of their struggle. And we look at that and we think, that's so hard. Polygamy would have been really hard. But in our day and age, we have things that maybe are similar, maybe are our version of polygamy, like maybe gay people within the church and how that works and what their membership should look like, and how can we be loving and accepting but still defend the gospel that the principles that we know to be true and that we hold dear. And I think the more we can make connections between the restoration and the trials that they went through then to the trials that we go through now, we will find more commonalities than differences, even though it was very different. And I think that the biggest takeaway I had was that faith in the Lord will be enough. If we just have faith in the Lord, that doesn't mean we'll never fall away. Orson Pratt fell away. He came back stronger as an apostle, and he was able to defend the truth. And John Taylor, he was prepared from the beginning. Each of us is prepared to do something that we don't know yet. That's the same with Timothy Foote. Sometimes we don't have to be the Relief Society president. We don't have to be the bishop. We aren't going to be recognized for our efforts. Sometimes we're just a normal member of the church, but that those efforts don't go unseen and that they have a bigger impact than we are aware of. And I hope you guys enjoy this presentation. And I say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.